Morning all. I know it's been a while, but like a lot of us, I've had a lot to think about. And I've been thinking about pride. Can we live without pride? Or should we? After all, isn't pride a sin? We should probably at least try to live without sin, but unless you're a religious scholar, it's not easy to unpick why pride is considered one of the seven deadly sins. The others, lust, gluttony, envy, sloth, wrath, and greed, are hardly straightforward, but they're a lot easier to pin down. I mean, I get that pride is a problem if you think you're too good to clean toilets. But surely there's nothing wrong with saying you're proud of your kids, especially if they, by their behaviour or their ethics or their determination, really are to be proud of, rather than just a knee-jerk reaction to what parents feel they ought to say. A less full-on example is being proud of one's own behaviour in a certain situation, or exhibiting pride in one's work, or in a task well done. Without any pride, that task may well never have got done, or at least not to such a high standard. So pride must have its uses, its utility, beyond not wanting to sully oneself by working at McDonald's. Traditionally, politicians have tended to leverage national pride, not necessarily because they feel it themselves, although some do, but because it is electorally sensible not to suggest that their constituents' country, which is a result of theirs and their forefathers' collective efforts, is anyway somehow lacking or worthless. To do so would be to blame the electorate for the country's failings, whilst at the same time elevating the particular politician who's saying it as someone who is able to fix their mistakes. People can be stupid, but they're not so stupid as to miss that kind of slur. Having said that, in the last 20 years or so, that is precisely what politicians, and even more so unelected bureaucrats, have at least been implying. The "you're all racist" narrative is bad enough when it's you being unfairly accused of it, but it's even worse when they're smearing your father or your grandfather of it. And even if it was true, if said grandfather had faced bullets, bombs, and bayonets, who cares if he was a bit racist? But this implication is perhaps more sophisticated than I previously gave it credit for. Whilst visiting a friend of mine in Belgium some years ago, we went to a local bar, and whilst we were there was another Brit there who was doing his best to speak to the locals in French, and he was making a fair fist of it, to be fair. But we got talking to him, and he seemed like a nice bloke. But he did that thing that Brits abroad, as at home, do when talking about their countrymen. He started disparaging them. Not in a particularly spiteful or malicious way, but he began making unfavourable comparisons. The English are so closed, so parochial, so unfriendly, or so stuck in the past, or whatever it was. And he said these things as if he were expecting me to agree with him. To be completely honest, I can't remember what his precise criticisms were, but for some reason I wasn't in the mood. I wasn't in the mood to let it slide, and so I challenged him. It was all very civil, and we didn't fall out or anything. But the tone of the criticism was that it was what it always is with a certain kind of Englishman. Namely, the English are sorely lacking in whatever virtue I have decided is important. But it is only I, as a superior and untypical Englishman, who can see the faults in others that I do not possess myself. Because it's always the same with these types. It's always every other Englishman, and not them, that have the problem. And these are the people, and probably more than half of them are not Englishmen at all, but English women, who are now running everything. These are the people who have not an ounce of affection for their own compatriots. These are the people that insist that we are all morally equal, but at the same time spend all their time disparaging, criticising and apologising for those English people that are inexplicably less morally valuable than any foreigner from anywhere, with the possible exceptions of conservative Americans and white South Africans. But to these types, who George Orwell identified and was obviously more than a little irritated by, even during the Second World War, pride really is a sin if it relates to pride in one's country. Or specifically, I should say, pride in England or Britain. The Scots, the Welsh, and particularly the Irish get a free pass and are allowed to feel pride in Scotland, Wales, or the Republic of Ireland. But pro-British Northern Irish Protestants are probably the only demographic viewed with even more distaste than the English. And it is these people, many of whom will be friends of ours, that are the biggest enemies of this country. They may not blow up tube trains or buses, go on stabbing sprees or get all their mates together so they can rape our kids, but their impact is, if anything, even worse. Because it is they who will make excuses for them, defend their human rights, and cover up for the bombers, the knifemen, and the child rapists. It is they who will call for lighter sentences for them, yet send men who shout at the police for not defending their daughters to prison for years, for all the damage that the gang rapists have done, and that is unquantifiably colossal. These people, the people who you went to school with, and who I clearly remember arrogantly describing themselves as the top 2% when they were getting free university education on our taxes, are the very, very real enemy. We have no greater foe than that. And this is where the battle lines will be drawn in the coming civil war. The civil war that they, the managerial class, believe will never come. And they believe that partly because their normality bias will kick in, and partly because they never mix with those of a different opinion, and so are utterly ignorant of how much they are, or will be, despised. But over the course of this Parliament, they will come to realise, or at least suspect it, and they will crack down harder, using the muscle of others, of course, as they have no muscle themselves, either figuratively or in reality, as they begin to understand that the great mass of the population are coming for them. And once they realise that, they will begin to understand that their only allies are, what, Muslims, Turkish barbers, Albanian drug dealers and sex traffickers, Somali machete gangs, or maybe even the 150,000 illegal boat migrants they have tucked up in luxury hotels up and down the country. And even if, in the coming conflict, that they and their mercenaries end up victorious, which they won't, they will be faced with the prospect of being in collaboration with tough, vicious and unprincipled savages without a native population to protect them. Whichever way it goes, it doesn't look good for them. They will be bringing PhDs to a gunfight. Now, it's probably no surprise that, like many of you, I often find our state of affairs somewhat overwhelming. My output and my creativity have, you will have noticed, fallen off a cliff. I speak to an ever-decreasing number of you, and I'd be lying if I thought my efforts were actually doing anything. And it's frustrating, knowing that I'm making next to zero difference. Even with my earlier modest amount of followers, I could feel that I was at least one of the foot soldiers. that whilst I wasn't in the thick of the action, I was at least in the trenches. Now I feel that I'm in a forgotten theatre of this war, like being posted to Cyprus in World War II, when battles were raging all around in Crete, Malta or North Africa. But at 57, I suppose to many, I'm 30 years too old to be in the front line. But nevertheless, I'm feeling increasingly responsible for not acting sooner, for not sounding the alarm, when I should have. I feel guilty for not caring enough, early enough. In my defence, I was under the impression that my peers cared at least as much as I did, even if, as I say, that wasn't quite enough. So I was suffering the delusion that, awakened from their slumber, they would, like me, make up for that relative neglect of our duties. And then our collective efforts would make the world right again. But never in my bleakest moments did I believe that those peers cared not at all. Never did I believe that they would surrender their principles, or their freedom to speak, and betray their neighbours, friends, and even family members to the authorities for defying the government. These past 5 years have shown me that I do not live in the world I thought I did, the country I thought I did, and that those that I live amongst are, for the most part, not friends or even allies. But, to paraphrase Will Rogers, they are merely enemies who have not yet had the chance to betray me. And it's hard to live with that realization. It's hard to have affection or to have pride in a society like that. It's hard, but then that's the whole idea. They don't want us to have pride. If we have pride, we might fight back. And everything they do, absolutely everything, is designed to destroy our pride without us fighting back. But they are sailing closer and closer to the wind, and they are getting bolder and bolder. And every time they push us back a little more, without the corresponding pushback, it emboldens them further. But they have factored in the possibility of pushback when it comes, by ensuring that all of their ducks are in a row when it comes, as it did last summer. Fast-track show trials, massively inappropriate prison sentences, even things that aren't even actual crimes, all delivered by their fellow activists in the so-called justice system, and a corresponding, highly visible, but nevertheless denied double standard to cement even further the deliberate impression that they can do anything to us and we can do nothing to them, no matter how guilty. But up until last summer, such as their disdain for us, they assumed that we didn't have a breaking point. And last summer was not that breaking point. That wasn't nearly the breaking point. But their reaction shows that their previous assumption can be assumed no more. They know that if things properly kick off, there will be nothing they can do to stop it, which is why they cracked down so hard last time. There is an obviousness to their reaction. They are very, very afraid of us, and they're right to be. As I've said many, many times before, their power is nothing more than an illusion. What is it that Sun Tzu said in The Art of War? When you are strong, appear weak, and when weak, appear strong. Last summer, they appeared strong. They appeared strong by demonstrating that they were prepared to abandon due process and the rule of law in order to punish their enemies. And in this case, the Labour side of the Unit Party's enemies are the working class, and they didn't care how it looked. Those partisan activist judges could scarcely contain their glee when exercising their illegitimate power to ruin the lives of much poorer people who, for the most part, had never harmed anyone. They liked doing it. they enjoyed it. And my intuition, which of course cannot be proved, is what they liked most was the humiliation. Taking a man, or indeed many women, from their homes and their families, from their children and grandchildren, at the very least utterly ruining them financially and sending their children into penury, causing them to beg for scraps from the state in order to survive, and quite literally throwing them to the walls in prison. The walls in question being the many, many murderers, rapists and acid throwers and terrorists that were undoubtedly waiting for them inside our ineffectual prisons that are reportedly being run by those of a particular faith. There was even an example of a commentator in the broadcast media, I wish I could find the clip, who noted with obvious and undisguised pleasure that the Southport protesters would soon be incarcerated with those of that particular demographic, who would be taking a very dim view of their opinions. This bloke, a typically soft, weedy, flabby media type, who you just know has never stood up for or against anything in his entire pathetic life and wouldn't last an hour, let alone a day in prison, was actually pleased about this. This is proof, if further proof was needed, of their hatred for us. These people don't want us to have pride, because for some reason their tiny, closed minds, they think we deserve their hatred. What that reason is unclear. But my intuition is that it is similar to the invective the anti-lockdowners faced during the Great Panic of 2020. They didn't care that people refused to wear masks, refused to get jabbed, or refused to stay home and save lives. No, what they cared about was that others, and not them, had stood against something, often at great risk to themselves. Those others had shown courage when they had demonstrated cowardice. Those others had stood by their principles when they had simply abandoned theirs. And those others had stood by their friends and their compatriots when they had appealed to totalitarian authority and gone running as fast as they could to tell teacher. It's no wonder they hate us. Similarly, and I know that this is a bit of a stretch, but I think that they are, in a subtle and important way, jealous of the lower orders as they see them. It is desperately fashionable in their circles to sneer at the behaviour of the working class, the heavy drinking, the street violence that often arises out of that, and the outfits of the hyper-competitive young women for whom male attention is the only game in town. And of course these things can go too far. Alcoholism, liver damage, real immediate damage from brawls getting out of hand, and, it must be said, sexual assaults from a race to the bottom in appealing to young men's basic desires. But the advantages to this behaviour, previously understood so completely that no explanation was needed, are now never aired and instead denied. Drinking culture forms a tight social bond which forms a community. The fighting, when it doesn't go too far, think two men, and only two men, duking it out in the pub car park with a crowd of onlookers who by their presence ensure that it does not go too far, forges young soldiers. And the British Army, at least until recently, had a fearsome reputation. Just ask any American soldier or Marine who served with them. This was something the British state of yore required and benefited from. The media class are jealous of men like that. And then there's the women. You know the types. Essex girls in white stilettos, in my day at least, absolutely full of life and squeezing every giggle out of it as possible while it lasts. The girls queuing outside a Sunderland nightclub in January at -2 in miniskirts and tops with spaghetti straps. From 18 to 25, they know that they are in their prime, and they make sure that everybody, especially the blokes, knows it. And there is absolutely nothing at all wrong with that. I certainly appreciated it at the time. As I say, things can go too far, and the more extreme can tip into looking desperate. But the way the narrative has switched is in the wake of the grooming gangs, utterly vile. For it is those pathetic media types that listen to, amplify, and give shameful credence to those voices, often from the complicit female relatives of the convicted gang rapists, that insinuate that those girls had it coming. Just look at the way they dress, and where were their mothers? Although it hardly needs saying, the gangs weren't preying on clubbers. They were preying on schoolgirls. Schoolgirls in school uniforms. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that those pasty, flabbing media types really are envious of the kinds of men who manage to land such women, rather than the women they've got, with their dowdy clothes, utterly sexless Rachel Reeves haircuts, and damned ugly shoes. I'll bet they're really jealous of them. And when one is so bitterly envious of others, pride, even as a concept, will be an alien one. For shame is the currency of the weak. For shame is the currency of weak, spiteful losers, and their weapon, and they will use it as often as necessary. Whatever it takes to make us as miserable and as self-loathing as they are. Just as Marxists were disappointed with the working classes flaunting BMWs and foreign holidays, so the bastard children of those Marxists are in turn disappointed with them for not abandoning their own nations and culture for an insipid, faux egalitarian globalism. But we do have pride, and as much as we try to deny it, or try not to rely upon it, it does seem to be a natural part of the human condition. It feels good to be part of a positive, healthy, flourishing culture. It feels good when we have something essentially to be proud of. And conversely, it feels very bad indeed when we are told that our culture is evil, racist, and worthless. When we start to believe that, we begin to give up. We begin to accept our fate. Of late, there has been much talk of civil war. Some say it is overblown. Others say it is inevitable. Some, who have never experienced the horrors of Lebanon, El Salvador, Yugoslavia, Iraq, South Africa, or Syria, talk about the prospect romantically, like modern-day Byrons, believing that its primary result will just be better poetry, rather than death squads, rapes, and genocides. Accurate or not, it is not something to be welcomed. And some say that it is unavoidable. But it's not. It is completely avoidable. All that is required is that we never complain, pretend never to notice what is happening, pay the jizya, and submit to Islam. The only thing that is required to avoid the coming civil war is for us to abandon our pride. The question we have to ask ourselves is it worth avoiding? Stay free, everyone.